Intelligence officials, even former CIA directors, have lost their security clearances before when they broke the rules or broke the law. What happened this week is brand new. The first time a president has personally revoked the security clearance of a former official, not for mishandling classified information, there's no evidence of that, but for speaking out against the president. And as the president told the Wall Street Journal, it was retaliation for John Brennan's involvement with the Russia investigation at the CIA. I call it the rigged witch hunt, and these people led it, said Trump. So I think it's something that had to be done. President Trump is now threatening to take action against others he blames for the Russia investigation. And his unprecedented actions have drawn an unprecedented response from dozens of former intelligence officials, including CIA directors dating back to the Reagan administration. It's a remarkable rebuke that raises a serious question. What does it mean for national security when the intelligence community and the commander-in-chief appear to be at war? Our chief global affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz, is in Jerusalem this morning, where she discussed this issue and much more with the president's national security advisor, John Bolton. Good morning, Martha.
Good morning, George. It was a wide-ranging interview. We talked a lot about foreign policy, the hotspots around the world, North Korea and Russia. But I started the interview by asking him about President Trump revoking the security clearance of John Brennan. Ambassador Bolton, thanks for doing this interview with us today. I know you're heading on to Geneva and Ukraine this week with lots of important issues to talk about, Russia, North Korea. But I want to start with another issue that is in the realm of national security, and that is President Trump revoking the security clearance of John Brennan. Should that have been done?
Well, this is a decision for the president. It's something that I think was originally suggested by Senator Rand Paul, perhaps others. I was aware of it along with, I think, most of the president's other senior national security advisors a few weeks ago. He obviously made his decision, and we go on from there.
He cited his authority to protect the nation's classified information as a reason, and also referred to Brennan's what he called erratic behavior, wild outbursts on the internet and television. Brennan has been a strong critic of the administration, but what does this have to do with protecting classified information?
Well, you know, I think Senator Richard Burr, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, whom I don't think anybody could accuse of being a gopher for the Trump administration, had some very trenchant observations on Brennan's behavior since he left the CIA. And I think also on his behavior while he was at the CIA. It was my view at the time that he and others in the Obama administration were politicizing intelligence. I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. And I think especially for senior intelligence officials, career intelligence officials who come out of the government, to keep that wall of separation between intelligence and policy. And I don't think Brennan has followed that. And, you know, whether he actually used classified information, I think people will be able to determine. But I think that's a serious problem.
Are there any specific examples that you think he used classified intelligence?
No, but I think there is
there
is a line, and somebody can cross it. I know from my own experience in the Bush administration after I left. I was accused by a senior State Department official of criticizing the administration's policy on North Korea and using classified information. And it happened, he was half right. I was criticizing the Bush administration, but I was not using classified information. Had I been, it would have been a different story.
I assume that John Brennan says the same thing, that he didn't use classified information. Would you have been fine if President Obama had revoked your security clearance for criticizing him, which you did frequently?
No, because I didn't use classified information there either. I say there's a line, and I think it's clear some people can cross it.
But let me be clear here. You're not sure whether John Brennan used classified information. You have no specific examples.
In terms of what he said, since he left, I think a number of people have commented that he couldn't be in the position he's in of criticizing President Trump and his so-called collusion with Russia unless he did use classified information. But I don't know the specifics. What I do know is when he was director of the CIA, I was very troubled by his conduct, by statements he made in public, and by what I thought was his politicization of the intelligence community.
So the line to you for people who should have their their security clearance revoked is if they use classified information, but you're not really sure whether he did.
If there's any kind of misconduct, I think there are lots of grounds to have your security clearance revoked for behavior that calls into question your ability to hold the material in confidence.
Okay, just a couple more on this. The criticism of this move has been very widespread. CIA directors Bob Gates, George Tenet, Michael Hayden, all of whom served under Republican presidents, expressing outrage. They called it an inappropriate attempt to stifle free speech based on political views, writing that this action is quite clearly a signal to other former and current officials. Are those concerns valid?
Well, look, as I said a moment ago, I've been through this myself. And had the senior State Department official, whose name I'll let go for now, persisted and tried to get my clearance pulled because I had been critical of his performance and others, yes, I would have objected to it. I don't think political disagreement alone is sufficient. But I think in the case, especially of a senior intelligence community official who violates the separation between intelligence and policy, I think those would constitute grounds.
But John Brennan can look at television, he can look at open source, and he certainly has testified in front of Congress.
Yeah, those are all things that a lot of people who have security clearances outside of administrations do. For me, the issue is whether he abused information that he obtained while he was director of CIA, or that he may have obtained perhaps erroneously or incorrectly after he left.
Okay, just the last one on this. The president does go way beyond Brennan. He says this raises questions about the practice of former officials maintaining access to our nation's most sensitive secrets long after their time in government has ended. You know that a lot of these people, let's take Bill McRaven,
Let's
who
take
also
me.
criticized.
I have done that as well, but I think it's certainly appropriate in a time when we're seeing what I believe are unprecedented leaks of highly classified information, to look at the question of how many people have clearances, how many people receive this very sensitive information, both inside the government and in the case of former officials. So I don't see that there would be anything wrong if it were determined to go that way, to review the policies about former officials having clearances. Sometimes it can be useful. In my case, my clearance was active at a time when I was a member of a board of directors of a company that did classified work for the government, and it was felt important that some of the directors be able to access that information. There were other times when I was a civilian that my classification was dormant, my security clearance was dormant, and I think that's appropriate too. But looking at that policy overall, I think might well be a good idea.
Okay, I want to move on to Russia and your trip here overseas. On the agenda later this week is a meeting in Geneva with Russia's national security advisor to follow up on Helsinki. Is there anything specific you want from that meeting?
Well, the meeting came about really as a result of the meeting of President Trump and President Putin in Helsinki. They decided that the two national security councils should get together, reviving an idea of having working groups that was set up by my predecessor, H.R. McMaster. I think I've spoken with Jim Mattis and Mike Pompeo about that. We've agreed that what we can do at the meeting on Thursday is look at the broad range of issues that might be open for discussion between Washington and Moscow and try and plan it out in a systematic way. So I'll go back and report to the President and my colleagues in the National Security Council, and we'll see what comes of the meeting and what the best way ahead is.
Since the Putin meeting, President Trump has directed you and the rest of the national security team to make election meddling a priority. We have clear evidence in the 2018 election that Russia is still trying to interfere. If Russia, as they tend to do, keeps denying they interfered, how do you have a productive conversation about that?
Well, I'm sure we'll have a discussion about it on Thursday. I had a discussion about it myself with President Putin when I went to Moscow originally to prepare the groundwork for his meeting with President Trump. President Trump raised it with President Putin. You keep raising it, and we'll see what their response is. But it's not simply a question of speaking with the Russians. At the president's direction, we had a press conference in the White House briefing room a couple weeks ago now with myself and four of the heads of the operating agencies and departments that deal with this to lay out at least as much as we could in a non-classified environment what we were doing, and there are a lot of things we're doing that we can't talk about specifically, and that includes both defensive and offensive cyber operations to protect the integrity of the election process.
President Trump tweeted this weekend that all of the fools that are so focused on looking only at Russia should start also looking in another direction, China. Just to be clear, have you seen any credible evidence that the Chinese meddled in our elections in the past or are doing so now? Is this a genuine national security concern?
Well, I can say definitively that it's a sufficient national security concern about Chinese meddling, Iranian meddling, and North Korean meddling that we're taking steps to try and prevent it. So it's all four of those countries, really.
But have you seen anything in the past specifically to China?
Well, I'm not going to get into what I've seen or haven't seen, but I'm telling you, looking at the 2018 election, those are the four countries that we're most concerned about.
And on Russia, and you just brought up cybersecurity, the director of the NSA, General Paul Nakasone, seemed to indicate in the White House earlier this month that he's been authorized to conduct offensive cyber operations in response to any kind of election meddling. What would that mean? What would he do?
Well, I think it means exactly what he implied. And again, this is a classified matter. I can't get into what we've been doing, but it's been certainly a priority of mine to make sure that we're using the full range of our capabilities to protect not just the elections, but a whole range of vulnerable systems in the United States, vulnerable to cyber warfare operations in the government and in the private sector. And I think that's something that's very important, because what we want is not war in cyberspace. We want peace in cyberspace. And to do that, I think you need to establish structures of deterrence so that our adversaries who have conducted cyber operations against us or who are contemplating it come to understand they will pay a much higher price if they do that than if they simply refrain. That's why offensive cyber operations are potentially so important. If you're simply always on the defensive, you're not going to create structures of deterrence, which is what we aim to do.
And on Syria, the situation in Syria was a topic in Helsinki as well with Putin. I know you'll be discussing that today with Prime Minister Netanyahu, especially about getting Iran out of Syria. Where do we stand on that?
Well, I think certainly the objective of the United States, of Israel, President Putin said it was Russia's objective, is to get Iranian forces, Iranian militias, Iranian surrogates out of the offensive operations they're in both Syria and Iraq, and frankly to end Iran's support for Hezbollah. I think the president's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal has put a real crimp into the Iranian economy. I think they're feeling it in their capability for the Quds force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards to conduct offensive operations in the region here and in Yemen as well. But I think this is part of the problem with the Iranian regime generally and why it's such a threat to peace and security, not just because of its nuclear program, but because of its military operations and its support for terrorism. So that's certainly on the agenda here in Israel.
Do you trust Russia to do this?
Well, I think President Putin was very candid in his comments to President Trump. He was to me as well. He doesn't think Iran.
They said they'd get rid of chemical weapons. They weren't all gone.
One issue at a time. He said he didn't have the same interest as Iran in Syria, and that he'd like to talk about ways to get out of them. I think it's clear that we believe, for example, on the subject of chemical weapons, as British intelligence and law enforcement concluded that Russia was behind the attack on the Skripals in Salisbury using the illegal chemical weapons agent Novichok some months ago. President Trump took very strong action, expelling over 60 Russian so-called diplomats in response to that. Sanctions have been imposed on Russia recently. We feel very strongly about the use of these illegal chemical weapons. That's why the president has twice struck in Syria after the Assad regime used chemical weapons.
Is Assad remaining in power an acceptable outcome for the U.S. now?
The interest that we're pursuing in Syria and in Iraq is the final destruction of the ISIS territorial caliphate, dealing with the ISIS territorial threat, and getting Iran back into getting its forces back into its own territory. That's what we're focused on. We're obviously concerned about a number of things, including the humanitarian situation in the region. We'll be discussing that here in Israel and with the Russians in Geneva.
And I want to turn to North Korea. It's been more than 2 months since President Trump and Kim Jong-un met in Singapore. You've said North Korea has not taken the necessary steps to denuclearize. In fact, there's evidence that they may be building another ICBM. So in your view, is North Korea serious about following through with this?
Well, I think it's important that they demonstrate seriousness. President Trump believes very strongly, he talks about it frequently, that the North Koreans have not tested ballistic missiles or nuclear weapons recently, that they've given back the remains of over 50 American service members, trying to identify who they are at this point. And I think Secretary Pompeo will be returning to Pyongyang soon for his 4th visit.
With direct talks with Kim Jong-un?
Well, that's what we expect.
That
I think the timing will be announced at an appropriate point by the State Department. But this is to fulfill the commitment that Kim Jong-un made in Singapore, that he had previously made to the South Koreans. And to move on with the process of denuclearization remains our highest priority.
Okay, before the summit, the administration talked about the goal of rapid denuclearization. Secretary Pompeo has now said the ultimate timeline for denuclearization will be set by Chairman Kim, at least in part, and that we are now practicing patient diplomacy. That sounds a lot like Obama's.
Yeah, I think the idea that we're pursuing the Obama administration policy in North Korea or any of the policies that failed before would contradict what President Trump has said repeatedly. Let me just say what our idea...
Let's go back to what Pompeo just said.
Yeah, well, let's go back to what Kim Jong-un said, which I think is of greatest interest. On April the 27th at Panmunjom, Kim Jong-un met with President Moon Jae-in of South Korea. And at that meeting, as President Moon reported to us, President Moon pointed out that the more rapidly North Korea denuclearizes, the sooner could come the benefits of openness to foreign aid from Japan and South Korea, foreign investment from any number of countries. President Moon said, let's get this done in a year.
And so you think within a year, is that the time frame?
And Kim Jong-un said yes. So the 1-year period that we've talked about, from the point where North Korea makes the strategic decision to denuclearize, is something that the North and South Koreans have already agreed to. And why is that significant? President Trump has gone out of his way to hold the door open for Kim Jong-un. That's what the Singapore meeting was about.
But how long do you give the North Koreans for their strategic decision to denuclearize? Do they really understand what that means? Should that have been written down?
It's hard to believe they don't understand it. Secretary Pompeo has done extraordinary follow-up diplomacy after the Singapore meeting. As I say, we expect that's going to resume in the near future. It's a hard task. I don't envy him, but he's worked very hard at it to pursue President Trump's goal of getting North Korea denuclearized.
And we'll be patient for how long?
I think we're counting on North Korea following through on the commitments that they've made.
And I just want to end here on Afghanistan. President Trump campaigned on ending the war in Afghanistan. In October, it will be 17 years we've been involved there. In this last week, you saw the Taliban try to take Ghazni. Since 2009, it's the worst year for civilian casualties. Is his strategy really working there any better than anybody else's has?
Well, I think the president's view has not changed since the campaign. I think he is determined to find a way to get a peaceful resolution in Afghanistan. We've looked at several different possibilities to get the Taliban and others directly engaged with the government of Afghanistan. There have been some signs that's moving in the right direction. We have a new commander of the Allied forces coming into Afghanistan in the next several weeks. He'll want to take a look at the circumstances there. I don't rule out that we'd have a change in some of the things we're doing there, but the president's view is that he'll support the government of Afghanistan in its efforts to see if the Taliban are finally ready to talk seriously.
It must be frustrating for you, too, because I feel like I've heard these arguments for 17 years, the same thing. The Taliban is desperate.
Yeah, well, what I remember over 17 years is the attack on 9/11. And I think the administration is determined that it never happen again. And that's the bottom line, is the security of the United States.
Would you consider privatizing there? using contractors instead of U.S. military?
Well,
there have been some reports about that this week.
There are always a lot of discussions. I find them helpful. I'm always open to new ideas, but I'm not going to comment on what the thinking is. That'll ultimately be the president's decision.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Bolton, and good luck with your trip.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Martha, you did cover a lot of ground there with Mr. Bolton, and we saw him double down on the president's decision to revoke John Brennan's security clearance, even though he didn't offer specifics on how classified information might have been abused there. And up against that, those 70 intelligence officials who serve for both Democrats and Republicans saying this has crossed a line.
They certainly have, George, and I think we really have to go back to that and look at those names. Robert Gates, Michael Hayden. I'm sure the current CIA director worked for most of those men over her 20 years at the CIA. So I think that is a very, very significant letter. You also have Bill McRaven. Let's talk about him a little bit. The retired admiral who was head of Joint Special Operations Forces, the man who led the raid, who coordinated that raid that killed bin Laden. McRaven says these are McCarthy-era tactics that President Trump is using. And when I think about it, and I think about Admiral McRaven, you got a whole lot of people, a whole lot of men and women who would follow him anywhere. So he is someone you have to listen to. His reputation is truly impeccable.
And Martha, it also seems this week the president's plans for that military parade in November in Washington fell victim to some pushback from the military.
It did. There were members of the military and veterans organizations who said they wanted that money spent elsewhere. There were estimates, some of them saying $90 million it would take to have that parade. And this didn't really start with the military. It started with President Trump wanting a military parade. They're expensive, they're extravagant, and the president has now changed his mind on that, but blamed local officials in D.C. And those local officials, as you know, George, came right back at him and said this was a very expensive endeavor.
Martha Raddatz, thanks very much. Great interview. Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.